Hey, welcome to week 3 of American Literature. This week we're going to continue with realism and naturalism. You watched several videos last week, and I may have forgotten to mention to you in the updated video that those come from a website called study.com. They're going to stop midway for you because the subscription to them is super expensive. But I think the information that you get before they time you out is actually pretty good. So I have one more of those this week that I'm going to ask you to watch. Our essential questions for this week are: what realities are writers trying to capture through realism, and what anxieties about a changing America are revealed? So you had part of the introduction that you had to read last week, and I'm going to accompany this week with a PowerPoint that came with the textbook for like classroom instruction. It's got photos, but a lot of really in-depth notes. And those notes cover the rest of the introduction, also reviewing the part of the introduction that you read too, and really expand upon that idea of a change in America post-Civil War. The immigration, the growth of population, all of these things that I call anxieties about a changing world. After the Civil War, about 40 years after the Civil War, the progressive movement begins, and that's when people are starting to look at all the growing pains that have happened in America, and they need to be addressed. Like industrialization comes with exploitation of child labor and women's rights and the right to vote, and all those things are going to become important at the turn of the century. But we're not there yet. We're still in around the 1880s, 1890s. So I'm going to ask you to think about those changes that have taken place in America as you read these post-Civil War works. So, let me find the cursor. Our video that I'm making right now goes here. And then this is one of those short study.com videos. It's going to stop about 2 minutes in, but the information that's there is good. Then I'm going to ask you to do some reading. Now, I've read these stories. Each story took me about 30 minutes to read. I consider myself a pretty slow reader, so do not wait until Thursday to try to do your work. As I've encouraged you, look on this Thursday at what is due so that you can, in your spare time, read during the weekend. And I actually read for leisure, so these are stories that I enjoyed. So these are the ones that I've selected for us to read together. The first one, The Wife of His Youth, is by Charles Chestnut. He was actually an African-American man from North Carolina who was writing. And so he is part of the realism movement because he is someone who is giving voice to characters of his own race. So this is not a white person like Mark Twain writing about black people. This is a black man writing about black people. And in this case, anyway, I'm not going to give away anything about the story. Never mind. What I do want you to be thinking about as you read this is what are some anxieties, some concerns or worries that have cropped up post-Civil War in a somewhat free society. Then this is a new one that's in the new edition of the textbook. This is Susan Farr's Mrs. Spring Fragrance. Actually, I think it might be Springtime Fragrance. I need to go back and edit that. It's on page 520. And she's a new addition to the Norton Anthology as it attempts to become more diverse. She's a Chinese American living in Seattle. And this is a story about misunderstanding that takes place because of these two different cultures, a Chinese culture that is Americanizing, and its children are Americans, but they are not. So anyway, that's something that I think would be interesting for you to read. Then Emma Lazarus is on page 403, and Emma Lazarus is the person who wrote the poem that's on the Statue of Liberty. And when you read about her, she was a well-known poet. This was not like her one-off, that poem that's on the Statue of Liberty, but that's the one that I want you to focus on. Then we have a little section on realism and naturalism. From the introduction, we learned that realism was sort of this catch-all to describe all the writing that was happening post-Civil War. So during the Civil War, or immediately before it, we were in a movement called the Romantic Movement. The Romantic Movement was very much about symbolism and when I think about things being romanticized, I think that they're not realistic. There's a lot about mood and emotion and feeling, and just I'm thinking about, like, if this were a picture of a landscape, you'd have a deer and a lion together, and there'd be clouds and sunshine, but we know that in real life, the lion is going to eat the deer, and that's realism. So the Civil War, as we read at the very beginning, is really important to the rise of realism, because you have, first of all, journalists and you have photographers, which no other war was photographed up until that point. And so both of those, journalists trying to describe things exactly as they saw them, and then the war trying to photograph things exactly as they were seen, gives rise to ordinary writers trying to describe things as they see them, and a real emphasis on ordinary people. And at the same time, an emphasis on the way people spoke, like Mark Twain is trying to imitate Southern accents, and that was regionalism, which was a part of Romanticism. So naturalism is going to move away from realism, and in some ways it's realism, but it's more like Romanticism in the sense that it focuses on impressions. So you know that your impression of something may not be reality. So writers in the 1890s are starting to question whether or not you can actually capture reality as a writer, or is reality always going to be skewed by your own point of view and your impressions of things. So the real focus of today is going to be, or this week, is going to be Stephen Crane's A Mystery of Heroism. Now, Stephen Crane wrote The Red Badge of Courage, which is considered the quintessential novel about the Civil War, which is interesting because he was not alive during the Civil War. He was actually born after the Civil War. No one was actually writing fiction about the Civil War. So sometimes some time needs to pass and some perspective needs to happen before someone can write about something. But Stephen Crane was a journalist, and actually he wrote another story called The Open Boat, which was inspired by his own experiences of being on a shipwreck. But The Mystery of Heroism is sort of it's going to keep us from reading The Red Badge of Courage, which is a novel. Instead, we're going to read this short story about the Civil War called A Mystery of Heroism. It's included here for you in a Word file. This was something that I used when I taught previously. And it's got some guided questions through it that you don't have to answer, but hopefully they will help you with your thinking. I want to mention, too, that with your book, I know that some of you want to, you may have borrowed the book or you may intend to resell the book, but a book has so much more value if you can annotate it. And so, like up here, I have these questions to think about. If you can be, marking the text while you're reading, it's so much more helpful to you. Use a pencil. Use Post-it notes. Because this last thing here, here's the PowerPoint that I mentioned that I want you to read. And then I have this Mystery of Heroism close reading assignment. I'm asking you to print this off so that you can annotate. It's going to look at a specific passage from A Mystery of Heroism. And everything that's happening in that passage, what does it mean? How is he using word choice and juxtaposition and imagery to create a mood or feeling, or impression, because that's what naturalism was all about. So you're going to read this passage and you're going to think about the characteristics of naturalism that you learned about from reading page 311 and from the study.com video that you watched the first few minutes of. And then you're going to compose a response to A Mystery of Heroism, thinking about how this demonstrates naturalism. So that's one assignment that you're going to complete this week. And then the second one is your poetry response journal. Stephen Crane also wrote poetry, so I'm asking you to take a look at his poetry, or you can respond to the Emma Lazarus poem if you'd like to. Remember that when you're responding to the poetry, you are looking at the form of the poem. That's how he is or she is organizing the poem. Like in the case of Emma Lazarus, that is actually a sonnet. And then you're going to look at things like imagery, diction, personification, all those things. And again, also when you're writing, you're also trying to employ your best grammar. Okay, so that covers this week. If you have any questions, please use the Remind app or you can email me.